Among those who have come up to worship at the feast of Passover were some Greeks. They approached Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and put this request to him: "Sir, we should like to see Jesus." Philip went to tell Andrew. Philip and Andrew in turn came to inform Jesus. Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. I solemnly assure you, unless the grain falls to the earth and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. The man who loves his life loses it, while the man who hates his life in this world preserves it to life eternal. If anyone would serve me, let him follow me. Where I am, there will my servant be. Anyone who serves me, the Father will honor. My soul is troubled now, yet what should I say? Father, save me from this hour, for it was for this that I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Then a voice came from the sky: "I have glorified it and will glorify it again." When the crowd of bystanders heard the voice, they said it was thunder. Others maintained an angel was speaking to him. Jesus answered, "That voice did not come for my sake, but for yours. Now has judgment come upon this world. Now will this world's prince be driven out. And I, once I'm lifted up from earth, will draw all men to myself." This statement of his indicated the sort of death he was going to die. Verbum Domini. Let us all be seated. Today is the 5th Sunday of Lent. The Father in heaven, when he instituted the Catholic Church, made it a point that there are certain very important events in the Catholic Church where it is important for us to prepare ourselves for what we call the general judgment. Christ came 2 times here on earth. The first time he came with great mercy. He came to forgive sins. But for his second coming, he will come with great justice. There will be hardly any mercy for his second coming. He will judge each one of us according to our desert. And so while the first coming of Christ on Christmas Day is a source of great rejoicing for all of us, and that's why we celebrate Christmas, but the second coming of Christ is filled with great fear because he will judge us with justice. Now, there are certain events in the life of Christ that is so important, like the first coming, the second coming. We have to be prepared for these very important events. And so, to prepare ourselves for this important event, God always gives us a preparation before those events, sort of a sign for us to prepare ourselves. Like, for instance, when Christ was about to come to earth the first time on Christmas Day, God gave us a very clear sign. And the clear sign was that there was going to be peace in the whole world. And indeed, during the time of Judas Maccabeus, Rome had conquered most of the civilized world, and there was peace. There were roads all over the continent. People could travel very fast. Roman soldiers were stationed all over the continent, and so there was peace. And the Old Testament kept on reminding us, when there is peace around the world, that means my first coming is imminent. And so the Jewish people who knew about this were prepared for the first coming of Christ. However, most of them were not prepared. Though God prepared them and gave them sign of the approaching of His first coming, they were not prepared. Only very few were prepared. The Magi, the shepherds, the Holy Family, and almost nobody else. And so in the Gospel for today, it begins with the words, "And the Greeks began to go to the temple, and they wanted to see Christ." Now, if you will notice, when Christ was born, He Himself said that the first that He is supposed to save are the Jewish people, and not the other tribes, not the other religions, but first and foremost, the Jewish people. And then God told us that the moment that Gentiles who were not Jews begin to enter the Catholic Church, then Christ is supposed to die. He is supposed to be crucified and die for us. So the Gentiles, those who were not Jews, were only supposed to enter the Catholic Church after the death of Christ, after the crucifixion of Christ. And so in the Gospel for today, when Christ saw that the Gentiles, the Greeks, were beginning to look for Him, and thus enter the Catholic Church, He said, because the Jews are already called, and now the Gentiles are entering the Catholic Church, it's time for me to die. So, the entrance of the Gentiles inside the Catholic Church is the sign that Christ had to die. And so in today's Gospel, when the Greeks began to be converted into the Catholic Church, Christ announced his death. It was time. So if you notice, there is always something that happens before a very important event in the Catholic Church. Now, after the Passion of Christ, after this Lenten season, Christ says, the second coming can occur anytime after my resurrection, anytime. It can be 1 year after, 100 years after, or 1,000 years after, but immediately after my resurrection, prepare for the general judgment in which God is going to judge everybody, whether he will go to heaven or he will go to hell. And what's the sign that God will give us? Well, Christ himself says the gospel would have been preached all around the world. And today, the gospel has been preached all around the world with mass communication, radio, television, cell phone, computer. Anybody can know the message of Christ in the gospel. Preached by Catholics, preached by Protestants, by heretics, by Orthodox. Everybody truly have heard the gospel of Christ. So what do we do now? That we have seen that the gospel has been preached all around the world. Well, we have to prepare ourselves that when Christ comes to judge us, he will find us deserving to go to heaven. How must we prepare ourselves? Christ in today's gospel gave us one way, one thing, just one thing to prepare ourselves. But he described it in two ways to make sure that we understand it correctly. And he said, well, the way to prepare is that you must be like a seed. That seed, if it doesn't fall into the ground, will be just one seed. For it to grow into a plant and produce plenty of fruits, the seed must fall down into the ground and die, and then grow into a plant and bear fruits. Now, what does that mean? Well, Christ says, just as he would fall into the ground and die, and in the whole process produce many fruits, meaning to say, save many souls. Those of you who want to go to heaven when Christ comes the second time must be like the seed that falls down into the ground, dies, and produce many fruits. How do you do that? Well, the ground had always been described using the word humus, something fertile. The ground is fertile. It's described as humus. For us, therefore, to imitate Christ, we must fall into the ground and die. To fall into the ground means to be humble. The word humble, Humility comes from the word humus, or soil or ground. All we have to do is to be humble, and if we are humble, we are like seeds who have fallen into the ground and have died. And the moment you become humble, you become a source of salvation for yourself, for your husband, for your wife, for your parents, brothers and sisters, and all those who meet you. In other words, you are going to have many fruits. You will bear many fruits. Now, Christ describes exactly this process of humility, dropping into the ground and dying, in another way. He says, those who love their lives will lose it, and those who hate their lives will save it. Putting it in simpler words, what Christ is saying is, if you love your life, you will lose your soul. On the other hand, if you hate your life, you will save your souls. Now, what does it mean to hate your life? It means that all the worldly things that you possess, worldly, physical things that you possess, including your life, you must use it in order to win heaven. Let's take a comparison. If you want to possess gold, you must have money to buy that gold. And therefore, to possess that gold, you must give up your money to pay for the gold. So the same thing with Jesus Christ. If you want to go to heaven, you have to pay in order to win heaven. And the payment you will use to buy heaven has to be given up, just as you have to give up your money to possess gold. And what is the price to possess heaven? That all the material things that you possess must be used to buy heaven. And how do you buy heaven? With, for instance, your money. Well, use your money for good works. Use your money in accordance to God's will, not according to your will. When you use your money the way you like, it means you love your life, and therefore you will lose your soul. But if you use all your money in accordance to God's will, using it for good works so you can win heaven, it means that you hate your life, and therefore you will save it. You will save your soul. And so the gospel for today tells us this is the message of Lent. Lent tells us that immediately after the resurrection of Christ, the end of the world and the general judgment will occur anytime. Either you die, and that's the end of the world for you, or Christ will come in His second coming. And how must you prepare yourself? The apostles were prepared. Christ, in his last day in Jerusalem, were preaching to the people how to prepare. In today's Gospel, fifth Sunday of Lent, Christ gives us in summary form and in vivid form two examples of how we must prepare. The two examples mean exactly the same thing. First, be like seeds. As long as the seed does not fall on the ground and dies, it will remain just one seed. But if it falls into the ground and becomes humble, then the seed would die, would be fertilized. It will grow into a plant, into a tree, produce thousands of seeds, and therefore is able to save many other souls. Or the second image, to make it more personal, you must hate your life, meaning to say, everything unspiritual, everything material, everything worldly, use it as your money to pay for heaven, to acquire heaven. And how do you pay it? Use everything, including your lives, in order to obey the commandments of Christ, to obey the will of God. He who obeys always the will of God in everything that they do, hate their lives. And because they hate their lives, Christ promised, you will save it. And then the gospel ends by saying, not only will you save your souls, but where I am, you will also be. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit,
Amen.
amen.